So then in the next chapter, which is the chapter that is the ninth series of the problematic, the question that Deleuze wants to ask is, what is then an ideal event? So what basically is an event? So he wants to move into a definition of the event as a singularity, and he says that the event is a singularity, or a set of singularities, or a set of points that define a mathematical curve, let's say, or the state of affairs in a situation, or a psychological situation, or a moral person. So an event is not just any old thing that happens in Deleuze. It actually corresponds, let's say, to chaos theory. Anyone familiar with complex dynamical systems theory is familiar then with what happens. An event is that which happens to induce a phase change in a system. You're boiling water on a stove, you apply the heat to it, and a phase change does not take place until the Bénard cells configure as little hexagons that begin the boiling process. That's an event, a singularity in the Deleuzian sense. That's a phase change, a bifurcation, a fork in the road that happens in a system that introduces a new set of conditions that are such that they change the state of the system forever. So, for example, if we have a movement from a static attractor, and then we have a phase change that induces a bifurcation, such as a catastrophic bifurcation, let's say, or an explosive bifurcation, that then changes the state of the system to that of, let's say, a periodic attractor. That's the event, is that phase change, that bifurcation point that completely induces a transformation in the system that changes it and orients it to a whole new set of conditions. And he says then that the event as singularity should not be identified with any of the three dimensions of the proposition. It has nothing to do with, for example, denotation or manifestation or signification. It has instead to do with sense, just as sense was the fourth dimension of the proposition. So the event as a singularity is also going to have to do with the realm of sense. And then so the minimal conditions of a structure are at least two heterogeneous series, and each one of these series has its own history. And its own history is the sum total of these phase changes that have given the series its identity, its unique identity over time. And so it's the event, and he uses event with a capital E, which Badiou never does. Badiou borrows from him this event ontology, and he never capitalizes the E, but he should, because the event is not just any old thing that happens, it's a particular point, a turning point in a system. Badiou says that the event is a turning point that can happen in any of the four domains of art, politics, science, or love, that induces a change that takes the status quo of a system and introduces something in it that was lacking from the system, changes its ground rules. But whereas for Badiou, the event, it creates the subject, it subjectivizes, creates the human subject by administering a truth event to which the human subject maintains his or her fidelity, whether this is a love affair, whether it's Haydn introducing the classical style in music that forever changes the history of classical music, or Galileo introducing new ideas into physics. It always subjectivizes and creates the subject, but in the case of Deleuze, as is evident from difference in repetition, and earlier in this book, the event can destroy the identity completely. It can actually be an event that's so powerful and so overwhelming that it actually undermines the stability of the self and creates a black hole or a vortex into which down the rabbit hole of the personality can go right down the rabbit hole. So what he wants to do then too is to say that the event is always ideational. It's purely ideational. And when it's realized concretely in actual states of affairs, it's not an event, it's an accident. So the accident has to be distinguished from the event insofar as the event is ideational. Remember that he's overturning Platonism here, and he's not identifying the ideas, the Platonic ideas, with the causes of things, but rather with their effects, the surface effects, the events. The events are the surface effects as singularities, which now become valid for all time. They have a certain universal character to them that Deleuze says belongs to the realm of the eon God from the Stoic tradition. They have a universality to them. So he's putting the idea, taking it from the realm of causes and putting it into the realm of effects, and he's substituting ideas for essences to overturn Platonism. So the accident is something that is contingent, and it's the way events are realized in particular circumstances. We should also distinguish, I think, between the event ontologies of Deleuze and Badiou on the one hand, and the accidentology of Paul Virilio on the other, who's fascinated with accidents and in whose work basically he says that the accident has come to replace the event, the historical event, in which we have cultural events or grand technological events that change the nature of Western civilization. Those are gone, and they've been replaced by this aleatory randomness of accidents and catastrophes that are the temporal equivalent of Marc Augé's non-places. Basically, an accident is simply the temporal equivalent of a non-place insofar as it has no history to it. It does not have an event status to it that is crucial for completely changing the system. There's a certain randomness about the events and the way they unfold today in our civilization. So then Deleuze moves on in this chapter to say that the proper mode for the realization of the event is the problematic, and this is a term that he's taken over from mathematics, and he reminds us that the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus defined theorematic geometry versus problematic geometry as a matter of theorematic geometry deduces attributes from essences, whereas problematic geometry has to do with those things that affect the logical outcomes of mathematical problems, such as conic sections or ablations or what have you, whatever that changes the outcome of the mathematical equation. So the events are realized in the mode of the problematic, and to say the events are always problematic. They are problematic, and they are distributed as singularities or singular sets of points that are distributed in a series, and they always involve a question, and they're always framed by a question. But Deleuze says that the question is itself formed by an aleatory point, not a singularity of points clustered in a domain with a solution nearby, but the question is determined by an aleatory point, and that the aleatory point, aleatory means wayward, basically random, the aleatory point corresponds to that blank space in the signifying chain that ensured the surplus of the signifying chain over the signified that we saw last time. So that corresponds to the paradoxical element that forms the problem, or rather the question inside which the problematic has to be resolved. And the solution is always there, but it never maps on exactly the solution to the question, and it always leads to a continual process of transformations. And he says that the relation then between mathematics and the human world should not be such that mathematics simply models or quantifies the human events, but rather it should be the case that it problematizes them, that human events should be seen as problematized, the way Lewis Carroll allegorizes mathematical problems. For example, he gives the example of the two lines, the one line, the older of the two, the elder, who takes the shortest distance between 2 points, but the young girl line wants to wander in a wayward fashion. She's more interested in curves and hyperboles and so forth. And I think that also in that passage, by the way, keys the reader into an awareness on Lewis Carroll's part of non-Euclidean geometry that was coming in now, that changes the conditions of the system such that in Euclidean geometry, the sum total of the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, but if you put that triangle on a curved surface, then the angles add up to more than 180 degrees. Here he says that it's the line that intersects the line and the curve causes the angles to add up to something less than 2 right angles rather than more than. But you can do things with the topology of space in non-Euclidean geometry that change the outcome of the system. And so I think Lewis Carroll was aware of this. But Deleuze says that what's not so much important about this is that it allegorizes mathematical problems as that it points out that the human psyche, by analogy, functions in a similar way to the problematic in mathematics, insofar as the psyche, too, is subject to singularities, to points that induce phase changes, depression. There's a point where you can be depressed for years, whereas you weren't before. Something happened to induce a phase change at some point, or anger that induces a sudden phase change, and so forth. That's the point in Lewis Carroll that has to do with the problematizing of human events. And so this is basically, in a nutshell, then, this is basically the essence of how he defines the event. And for him, the event and the singularity are the absolutely important thing in his ontology of difference and events and singularities and so forth that overturns Platonism.